biomechanics and physics, like internal pressures and all that, is such a big piece, but I don't hear volume talked about a lot.
Mm-hmm.
At least like from what I've seen. So I guess one of my things that I've been thinking about is just sort of, when do you determine, or how do you tease out whether, someone comes to you with an issue, whether it's, I mean, I guess it's probably a combination of both, but like when the limiting factor is necessarily just volume and tolerance or capacity versus when it's like a biomechanical problem, or not problem, but like they're missing some adaptability or ability to move in a certain way.
Well, I want to always be, putting the activity, the functional activity that they're complaining about, into a continuum, right? So when you look at it from a perspective of like a continuum, there's always going to be a volume issue that you're going to have to be able to manage. But part of that volume issue might just be actually getting them like in a position or some group of positions that's more advantageous, more efficient for them to tolerate more volume, right? So I think it really depends on where your person is starting. If for my clientele, a lot of times, like, they haven't started volume, right? So they don't have a volume in which to kind of mitigate from an exercise standpoint. So I'm actually just trying to figure out like what they can do, what they feel safe doing, like psychologically and physically, right? And I'm trying to check some boxes where it's like, okay, do they have pain in any movement? And if they do, where is that pain initially provoked? Which is really important to understand, because then I can kind of put them somewhere within that movement complaint that they actually do feel safe. And then now we have a starting point. Sometimes it is just like, yeah, you're good until you go this long. And then this long becomes the onset of pain, right? More than at a certain range of motion, or if they lose postural control in some way. So that's something that has to be divvied out when there's like a symptom to actually play with. Does the symptom, when's the provocation of symptom? Does it come on when you move a certain way, or does it come on when you just move for a certain duration of time? Right? So once that is figured out, and I want to figure that out first before I actually like start to manipulate biomechanics. But if it is a volume thing, right? So say gait is something that I see a lot. Like they can walk, but they just have pain if they walk too long, right? So at that point, if I hear that, like I'm going to talk to them about how to vary up their walking, right, in as many ways as possible, so that they can go the duration that they want to go, but still not have pain. So like we're looking at, how do you vary then? Like, do you vary the shoe you wear? Do you vary the surface you walk on? Just giving somebody a different option for walking, like teaching them to walk a different way, not that it's the right way, but just a different way that they're doing all the time, is a version of variability, which then actually focuses on volume control in a way, right? Because even if they're going the same duration, but you have them have another option, they can use more than one strategy to go that duration. Now you've, say, given them like they've half the volume there because they're using 50% one strategy. And I'm just, I'm kind of being crude with the numbers there, but just by giving them another option and allowing them to vary things more is a way of managing volume, right? So, but in order to do that, you do have to touch biomechanics in a way. You have to touch like the technique of gait, right? And you have to practice that. So I don't know that you're ever like just doing one and not doing the other. Like they're all in this big continuum that matters. But I think the first thing I look for is like, what's the main thing that provokes a symptom? And I want to be as specific as I can with that provocation.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And then so if we're like, I guess looking at walking, for example, or gait, when you're working on that with clients, are you trying to have them be consciously aware of what they're doing while they walk, or is it like just should innately happen if they get access to certain ranges?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that innately happen
Yeah.
is like a thing. I think things become automatic in a way, but
Mhm.
like you always want to have mindfulness of the difference, or sort of different options of what you're doing, right? So I think sometimes like that you hear that a lot where it's like, well, you shouldn't have to think about how you're moving if you have all of your ranges of motion or if you have like your full excursion of breathing. Like, I think that's nonsense. I think like what we're teaching people is actually to be better at being mindful. But then as we get better at some things, like some things have to become automatic to get to higher levels of awareness and higher levels of movement capacity and quality. So I think, from a walking standpoint, I usually teach it to people from like the slow and the fast. Like I actually take it from both extremes, if you will, where I will use a slow walking or even just static positioning type of drill where I'm showing people 3 positions of gait. Can they hold those positions? Like, how's their balance? What's their posture look like? Do they understand their postures in static positions? And then can they flow through those static positions very slowly and still be able to maintain the control and not have pain? So that's a really good way for me to be able to find the onset of provocation during gait, is I just slow people down first statically and then like basically slow motion within the gait cycle. I just call it like a slow walking drill, right?
Mhm.
And I can start that with or without arm motions to create like more of a reciprocal type of movement there. And then I'll teach people like to walk fast when they walk faster, some different cues that they can use quickly to make a change to how they're currently walking. And the first one I usually use is just quick and light. Like, so increase the cadence, decrease the stride length, and make sure that you're not landing light. You're not thinking like you're pushing off. And I'll have them practice that. So I like to give the cue of like, imagine someone's pushing you from behind and you're just going with the flow of that, as opposed to you're trying to like, you stride out to get from one point to the other, right? So that's the first cue I usually start with when I'm trying to get people to like not have to think about things so much, like with every step, every aspect where they're putting contact with their foot, just walk a little faster and actually take shorter strides. And that usually can be helpful. And that's at least where I start people.
Mhm.
Okay.
That makes sense. Yeah. And yeah, it's just the talking about that as a continuum is really helpful, just because I think yeah, like biomechanics is touched on a lot at times, but like at a certain point, volume's going to matter no matter how good your biomechanics are, or how many different variable positions you can hit, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think when you're looking at training or when you're looking at athletics, as you start getting into conditioning a bit more, right? Like volume really matters. And then it's sort of, to me, it's like when you talk about biomechanics, I just think of it as like you're talking about like efficiency to people. So actually having somebody work with like a more cardiovascular type of program, it starts to like make more sense. Like the efficiency of movement starts to make more sense when somebody feels like they're kind of hitting a wall, or they're starting to complain about a provocation of something they don't like. They might not look at it as like, oh, this is a pain, this is like an irritation that would limit me. They just might think of it as like, when I get to this point, of running or rowing, like what really stops me here is just like my right front of my hip, or like the front of my knee, or just like my right quad close to my knee is just like so fatigued compared to the rest of my body. Well, those like become like indicators of how they're using their body that they wouldn't have felt early on in that process, right? So yeah, volume plays a role there, but could we also look at, in that moment when they start to feel like that becomes a problem, can we give them a different way to do the same thing that just switches the pressure, switches the, what they feel, and that allows them to go longer. But I don't think it's like, I don't think you have to start there. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think it's a right or wrong thing. I think you let the symptoms teach people how to move their body when they're going for longer, especially when it's like a single task that they have to do for a longer period of time. Now, then there's also sort of things that are more in the like power strength realm that you're not doing for long periods of time, that your feedback of how heavy you can lift, how comfortable does a heavy weight feel to you, right? Or like how much velocity can you move, and what are some of the cueing that you would use to get you to move a little faster? Like, it doesn't always correspond though, right? Like if you teach somebody something new that you might think is more efficient, which in the long run may be more efficient, they're not necessarily going to be faster or stronger with that initially because they have to practice it. But they have now another option that you can give them, that they might be worth kind of working on and practicing and seeing if it gives them a better performance result, right? But like ultimately, like I'm not messing with people's technique too much unless there's a symptom that I'm working around, or it's if I ask somebody like that's new to a task to do something and they're just obviously not doing what I'm asking them to do. So this is where I look at something like the hip hinge is a movement pattern that I have a general idea of what I'm looking for when I think of a hip hinge. If I tell somebody to pick something up from the ground and they just don't do a hip hinge, like they don't have that in their game, I'm not going to just like load them up doing that. I'm going to teach them a hip hinge first, right? And that's biomechanics, but it's also just like joint dissociation, right? It's moving from where I want them to move from where they're not doing that, right? And it's, I don't think they're going to blow up if I don't fix that, but it's also, they're just like, that's not what I had in mind for them, right? So that's why I would change that before I would change their volume. But this is usually somebody who's like brand new to a certain lift. And when that's the case, like that's, you're always starting with like teaching the movement, whatever your thought process is for what you're trying to teach. And, a lot of times they look like the same thing. A squat looks like a squat, a hip hinge looks like a hip hinge, but different people have different ways of teaching the squat. And I have different ways of teaching the squat depending on who I'm dealing with, depending on what I'm trying to work around. So I'm not trying to limit myself to like one way to teach something at all, because I think that limits you. But I think there are times where it's just obvious, like they're not doing what I want them to do at all. So I'm not programming more volume into this. I'm going to just work on the pattern. And then I'm going to find some things like from a capacity or conditioning standpoint that they can do what I'm asking, maybe simpler things. And then we can go a bit harder there. We can build volume there.